This is just the beginning.
Hello, and welcome to the Future of the Flexible Workplace virtual event. I'm Kim Hart, National Technology Correspondent at Axios, coming to you from Arlington, Virginia. Thank you to Density for making this conversation possible on the future of the flexible workplace. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and of course on Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and #Axios Events. Over the next 30 minutes, I will be joined by my colleague, Asia Whitaker-Moore. We will unpack how employers are rapidly reimagining their workforce for a post-COVID-19 world. Our first guest is the Senator from New York, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So a key part of the new flexible workplace is allowing flexibility for working families. And family paid leave has been a topic that you've been passionate about for quite some time. You recently reintroduced the Family Act, which would call for 12 weeks of family leave for any family member, paid family leave at that. And I wanted to ask, why now? This is something you've been talking about. This is not the first time you've introduced this bill. Why is it so especially relevant today?
Well, if you could imagine pre-pandemic, if we had had national paid leave in place, this pandemic would not have been so disastrous for working families. It would not have upended the careers of caregivers, resulting in over 2.5 million women no longer employed, unwillingly so. What we've seen during this pandemic is that a lot of our women and women of color are frontline workers. So they are essential workers, have to be in the workplace. But at the same time, we also saw that in two-parent families, oftentimes it was the woman of the two-parent families who was asked to stay home or chose to stay home to watch children who needed to be learning online. Disproportionately, those choices were made and more women stayed home. So what we've seen is a pandemic that has really harmed the trajectory of so many women who were on their way earning living for their families, who are now displaced workers. And without it, we don't have that safety net that we needed. If we'd had it, then women, men, people with children could have had up to 3 months off paid to be home with a child who's being schooled at home, or to care for a loved one who had COVID, or someone who lost their job but needs care. That would have all been possible. And unfortunately, it wasn't. And if you look at the December numbers, there were 140,000 jobs lost that month. And when you now add all the ones gained by men and women, it was 140,000 net women jobs lost.
And before the pandemic hit, this was a topic that was being talked about. I know several cities have implemented their own paid leave laws. In some situations, some states have been looking at it, but it was not really something that was looked at on a national basis. And do you think that it now is more considered to be part of the public health infrastructure for the nation?
I do. And I think that people now recognize that we are the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have paid leave. And it's a real drag on our economy because it means too many people have to leave the workforce to meet a family need, an urgent family need, notwithstanding new children. When there's a new baby, oftentimes a parent will stay home. If they don't have access to paid leave, they have to quit their job. Or if they need that job and can't stay home, well, then they'll have to find informal care for an infant. So it applies to all family events, applies on a gender neutral basis. And the experience that has happened in various states has been so positive. California has had paid leave now for over a decade, and businesses agree, 99% of them agree it improved morale and retention, and 90% believed it had no negative impact on their bottom line, and would have a positive impact on their bottom line. So the facts are in, and it's really good for business, and it's really good for the economy. And so I think it's an idea whose time has not only come, but people understand now what difference it could have made during this very pandemic we are still in.
And what kind of feedback are you getting from your colleagues on Capitol Hill, specifically in the Senate, on this piece of legislation? Are you seeing more of an interest in moving this along?
I am. We're getting more and more co-sponsors who want to join on to this legislation. I'm working across the aisle to try to find Republicans who are willing to support this version of paid leave. The good news is several Republicans have come up with their own versions of paid leave, none as complete or far-reaching, but the fact that they think it's important to at least have ideas in this space is real progress. So I'm hopeful with President Biden as our president, there'll be more momentum and more reason to support paid leave. We're hoping that national paid leave will be in the next infrastructure bill, because if you want to build back better, that needs both hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, sewers, and soft infrastructure like paid leave, making sure we have a strong care economy, affordable daycare, universal pre-K. These are the kinds of ideas that allow workers to be at work, to be able to earn a living and help grow the economy. And so it's very much part of the infrastructure debate, because we need both hard and soft infrastructure to get this economy moving again.
And you mentioned President Biden. What could the White House be doing more to push this along? You mentioned the infrastructure bill. Are there other measures that you think the federal government could be taking from the White House on down when it comes to advocating for paid leave?
I think that the more we lift up the issue and talk about what difference it could make today in recovering from this pandemic, there's still schools that are not opening in person. There's still parents that are being forced to stay home. We could really use paid leave right now. And so I think the White House just continuing to add its voice to their support for paid leave is extremely meaningful. And to the extent any federal worker or any military personnel does not have access to paid leave, it should be made available to them. Anything in their purview is helpful.
And as we talked about earlier at the beginning of the interview, this is something that you've been passionate about for quite some time. Tell me a little bit about your experience with paid leave. You're a mom, you're a member of Congress, you're a former attorney. How did you handle this when your children were born?
So when I had Theo 17 years ago, I was working at a law firm and they didn't actually have a paid leave policy. So I asked if I could write one for them. And at the time, I modeled it off of what state of the art was for law firms in the area. And that was a 3-month leave for primary caregivers. And so I created that paid leave program and made sure that someone who took leave would not be punished in their compensation, but could continue to earn a living. And it was adopted by the firm. I'm sure they've improved it over time, but it was unbelievably important to me at the time. When I was pregnant in my last month, I was so tired. I can't imagine after giving birth having to work the kind of hours I was working at a law firm and learn how to nurse a new infant, learn how to become a mom, have time to bond with my son Theo. All of that really mattered. And so to have that 3 months off as the primary wage earner was absolutely necessary. And to be able to be compensated during that time allowed us to keep up with our rent and be able to pay our bills. And so it made a huge difference to me personally. So when I became a House member, we didn't really have paid leave in Congress either. So I wrote a paid leave policy for my staff that they could also take up to 3 months off paid for any family event, gender neutral. And that's the basis of the national paid leave bill I've now written and hope to get included in the infrastructure bill.
Makes sense. And I can relate. I just returned from maternity leave about 6 weeks ago from having my third. And to your point earlier, having a baby in a pandemic is so much more stressful than usual. And it's pretty stressful as it is. And so families trying to make ends meet while figuring out how to live pandemic normal with a new baby is quite challenging. Tell me a little bit about what you are seeing from the business community when it comes to implementing their own policies, like the one that you wrote for both your law firm and when you became a House member. Are you seeing more individual companies creating this policy on their own without federal action?
So I do. I think companies that want to retain their workforce and keep a positive, healthy work environment are offering paid leave. But the real challenge is it's hard for a small business to offer paid leave on its own. It's hard to compete with the super successful large businesses that can offer it. And so the reason why national paid leave is such an elegant solution is that it's very inexpensive. If it's a national program, it only costs $2 a week for each employee. within a year, that's $104 a year per employee to set aside so they can have paid leave when they need it, and for that employee to match it. It's affordable, and any small business with even 1, 2, 3 employees could do that. So that's the difference. This levels the playing field and allows small businesses to compete with the big businesses who can already afford it. But the biggest businesses that want to retain women, want to retain diversity, want to retain a complex workforce, they need to offer paid leave to everyone for all these life events.
Senator Gillibrand, thank you so much for joining us today on this topic.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. And next, we have a View from the Top segment with my colleague, Chief People Officer at Axios, Lenke Taylor.
Now joining us from San Francisco, co-founder and CEO of Density, Andrew Farah. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Tom. Hey.
Great to have you here today. Andrew, we both are aware that the pandemic has accelerated a number of trends that were already underway. But I was surprised to learn that smart buildings, or aware buildings, which I find a slightly disturbing term, are a part of that phenomenon. So let's start there. What is the big picture when it comes to the future of smart buildings?
Well, we have been building buildings for thousands of years without knowing how they get used. And for the last half decade or so, that has started to change. Organizations are starting to instrument and deploy infrastructure that helps understand how humans are actually using space. And the pandemic has accelerated that timeline. So what was going to happen over the next decade is likely going to happen in the next 24 to 36 months. And when organizations talk about buildings becoming aware, I agree that sort of terminology is a bit Orwellian. I think that what is maybe a better way to describe it is that there's a really important distinction between whether or not we are deploying infrastructure that is essentially cameras and setting us up for long-term surveillance, or systems that are anonymous at source. And I have a bias on which technology is sort of appropriate in the current circumstances, but the pandemic has really created some urgency on trying to measure all of the space that we use, and particularly all of the space that we don't.
So let's start with density, because you're one of the first companies to really measure how space is actually utilized. Tell us how you do that.
Well, we build a system that measures depth data. So we don't collect PII. There's no gender, age, or ethnicity. We build both the hardware and software that allows you to measure humans in physical space. And what that actually looks like is a device at the point of entry, and a device that kind of looks like a wireless access point that's a radar-based system for open area detection, unbounded space. But I think that the salient point here is that the hardware only matters insofar as it is preserving privacy, that it is accurate, and that it's real time. After that, the real value is in the software that makes sense of utilization, comparing that to cost per square foot, comparing that to the buildings that you reopened. I mean, we were working with one organization who opened a building for over 1,000 people in the middle of the pandemic because they are in a business where they needed to reopen, and utilization remained below 1% at its busiest moment. The importance here is that the tools essentially now exist to be able to measure whether or not that's actually happening. And that's extremely exciting.
And moving beyond accuracy, you touched on this a little bit before, but there are privacy issues at play. Can you explain a little bit about that and how some buildings collect data that puts that sort of at risk?
Sure. I'm sure that you saw the recent news about Verkada. I believe it was 150,000 cameras being compromised because of a plain text superadmin password being available on the internet. Those that got in got access to Tesla's factories. They got access to public tech companies' offices. They got access to St. Luke's and to Sandy Hook Elementary. I mean, we're talking about essentially laying new infrastructure that the pandemic has sort of mandated that will either serve us or serve to undermine us. And I think that we ought to be very conscious about the type of technology we decide to deploy and under what conditions we're willing to use the blunt, sort of lazy instruments that are cameras. And I say that without malice. I actually think that really the question is, if you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, if an occupant has a reasonable expectation of privacy, don't deploy a camera for non-security purposes. If it's a space where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy, then it's perfectly reasonable to measure that with a camera-based system. And I just think that we tend to do a lot of things in the name of safety. We did a lot of things with Prism after 9/11. We do a lot of things in the name of security and safety, and I think that the pandemic is not an exception to that rule. And it's really important that we're careful about what we do now, because we're going to feel those decisions and the consequences of them 4, 5, 6 years from now.
And we've touched on accuracy, we've touched on privacy, and I seem to remember there's also a business case to be made here too, isn't there?
On measuring how buildings are used?
And just the cost around using cameras versus your approach?
Well, I'm not trying to pit density against all camera-based systems. I think that the point that I'm maybe trying to call out is that there isn't a future in the next 5 years where a building gets built, but whose performance we don't measure. That is changing, and it's changing as a result of the urgency that the pandemic has driven. And when you sort of fast forward to a world you can imagine the surface of the earth of built physical space, you can imagine sort of the surface of the earth actually being measured. What is going to end up happening is we're going to be able to redesign how cities work. We're going to be able to redesign, and I don't mean density, I mean we generally, being able to make material improvements in how we load balance the demand for space. Dramatically improve the experience of folks, because for every space where there's a 1% utilization, there are spaces at 148% utilization, substantially beyond sort of the expected or target design. And I think architects for years have been making the case for we need more than just point-in-time measurement, where you have the state of the art today is someone wandering around with a clipboard, observing human behavior, taking notes, and then putting that back into a space utilization report. And for the first time ever, we will have continuous, real-time, highly accurate, non-invasive data about how our physical space is used. And that is extremely exciting for so many reasons.
Finally knowing what we need and using that to help us design. I think that sounds really, really powerful. Well, thank you, Andrew. A fascinating discussion that I think we could have for hours and hours, but appreciate the time and your perspective and insights.
Thank you, Tom.
And thank you, Density, for sponsoring this segment and the one before and the one coming up with my colleague, Asia Whitaker-Moore.
Thanks, Dominique. Hi, I'm Asia Whitaker-Moore, Managing Editor of Business at Axios. And our final guest is Chief People Officer at Twitch, Lenke Taylor, joining us from Austin, Texas. Hi.
Hi, Asia. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So as CPO at Twitch, you've really focused on sustaining a resilient office culture during a profound shift towards virtual work. So I'd love to kick things off by asking what changes over the past year you think are going to be permanent fixtures of the new workplace.
Sure. Well, so much of our culture at Twitch is around community. That's what the Twitch service is about, and that very much goes into our employee culture as well. So our employee culture was very centered around our office, and we were able to flip that very quickly to virtual. But one of the things that we definitely saw in terms of affecting community across our employee population was the ability of our employee resource groups to really create more connection and community in a virtual space. So they existed prior to our pandemic, but during the pandemic, they really switched from being location-based to location agnostic. And that enabled people to create better community, to find people who were like them, to have shared spaces, and to further drive our goals around inclusion and diversity in our workplace. So I definitely think that is something that is going to carry forward as we move out of the pandemic, that now we've learned this ability to really think about our internal employee resource group communities beyond location. The other thing I think is going to really sustain is flexibility. So one of the things that we learned through this pandemic was how individual employees' needs were about what they needed to thrive. And I think one of the things that we're still hearing from employees is that they really value the flexibility that they've gotten during this period, and they're looking for ways to continue to have that as we come out of the pandemic work from home period.
And I guess as a follow-up to that, I'd say, people are also looking for clues around the things that are temporary. So what are some of the things from the in-office culture that are going to be lasting and that are going to continue on in a post-pandemic world?
Yeah, well, again, our focus is really around community. So without question, our offices are still going to play a role for people to come together. And that's likely going to play a very different a role than it did in the past, where people came to the office almost every day, 5 days a week. I think what we're going to see in the future is that the office is a place where some people come on a pretty regular basis, but we really use it for places for teams to come together, for project teams to come together to strategize, and for employees to connect face to face, and then take the opportunity to go back and work remotely or flexibly from home to complete their work.
That's helpful. Thank you. I think another thing over the past year that has really come into focus is the plight of working parents and caretakers in general. And they've been, hit especially hard by the pandemic. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the flexible options that are designed specifically for those employees that have really kind of come out as a result of the pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think early on, we realized that we needed to listen to our employees to understand the experiences that they were having in dealing with working from home, which I often remind people, we weren't just working from home, we're working from home during a pandemic, which means not only our parents, but other employees across the company had additional things happening in their lives outside of work that were affecting their ability to perform their work just as if they had taken a regular day and come to work from home. So one of the things that we heard from employees were about things that we could do across the company as a total, and individual experiences that people were having that we couldn't optimize for. So we recognized immediately that we needed to have some programmatic things across the organization, but again, lean into flexibility so that people could do what they needed to do to support themselves to thrive during this time. So some of the examples of things that we implemented was a no meeting block during lunchtime. This allowed people, not only parents, but other employees, to take a break from their video calls, to prepare themselves lunch and or lunch for their children and family members, or people who were looking after children going to school, to be able to engage and help those individuals. Another thing that we implemented was flexible work arrangements. Again, this came a lot through the voice of our parent employees, but ultimately applied to other people who had COVID circumstances that required them to need some sort of flexible arrangement and understanding with their manager about when they were going to be available to work and when they needed to attend to something in their life, like helping children get on their online classes or trading off with a spouse to support children that way. We've also seen that our Parents Guild has been incredibly strong again during this period. That's our employee resource group for parents, sharing ideas and things around what parental needs were. And it's been so amazing to see them collaborate and communicate with each other and support each other. Because again, parents had so many different needs depending on their personal circumstances, the ages of their children, that again made it best for us to lean into flexibility and creating the opportunity for people to share and find the resources that most supported them and what they needed in this particular time.
I think that's a good segue into, you mentioned your employee resource groups. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, the communication from those groups back to you. How did you, hear from your resource groups in terms of what they needed, what they wanted, and how were you able to, then action on responses to that?
Yeah, well, listening to our employees takes lots of forms. So in addition to our employee resource groups having regular meetings or Slack forums where myself and my team members and other leaders in the company can engage and understand what they're doing. Our employee resource groups each have an executive sponsor. That person helps to be a conduit of information and helping us understand how that particular community is feeling. And then we also have employee surveys that we do, either for particular groups or particular subjects, or of course our broad company engagement survey. And we use all of that information to help inform the things that we're going to do. My team and I also hold individual times where we communicate with groups, whether there's a specific need, or I myself regularly hold employee roundtables where I have an opportunity to hear directly from employees about their experience. And that helps often take things that we know broadly might be an issue to really understanding the individual perspective and what their experience is like. Because my team is very much focused on driving the overall employee experience at the company and making sure that people feel like we're supportive and inclusive and aware of what their experiences are as they work here.
Yeah, you mentioned your team, and I guess that's another big change that we've seen post-COVID is the role of the HR group and the C-level HR position moving to really a front and center decision maker during COVID. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the chief people officer role pivoting during the pandemic to now helping define what the business looks like in the next year or so, especially at a company that's going through hyper growth. So how is HR changing in this new environment?
Yeah, you're right. At Twitch, we had this very unique thing of not only going through this pandemic, but having incredible growth on our service and across our company at the same time. And as I mentioned earlier, we had started with a place where our workplace, our physical workplace, played a big part in thinking about our culture and our employee experience. So without question, over the last year, it's been an incredible time to be a people leader. Certainly in my experience here at Twitch, and I know from talking about my colleagues elsewhere, that's true as well. It's just been an amazing opportunity to further bring that employee experience front and center to the business overall, to helping our leadership understand what our employees' needs are and weigh that across with what the business needs are to set up the best way forward for how we can work with our employees, what the environment is, and what we're further doing to support them and make them successful so that they can thrive in the organization.
And I think a lot of companies, along with their HR representatives during this time, have had to really look at their culture and make adjustments to help, employees feel connected. So if you could tell me a little bit about the evolving importance of kind of community in the workplace and, maybe some of the things about, the culture at Twitch that has kind of shown through in the work from home environment that maybe was surprising or not surprising, depending on your perspective.
Well, absolutely. The culture of community also drives our culture of inclusion. And I talked a bit about the importance for us of focusing on driving inclusion across the business, as we believe that that's the core to then helping us increase diversity across the organization. So in terms of the community things and sort of the culture things we've done across the organization, some of that was driven by our virtual events programming, where we took in-office experiences or things that allowed people to come together across community and explore that through internal events. We've done super fun stuff like surprise and delight our employees with packages in the office, including the famed cookies from the Twitch San Francisco office. And so really finding those ways to bring the Twitch community and the Twitch workplace into their lives at home and allow them to feel connected has driven just an amazing response from our employees who talk about how strongly they feel they've been supported by the organization and how much they appreciate the things that my team and certainly the company is doing to help them thrive during this time.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess there's been a lot of technological support and technological advances in, supporting this move to remote work. So what are some of the, flexible working options that have been enabled by technology, and how are you guys thinking about that both, domestically and globally in the new world?
Well, that is really something that for us is continuing to evolve. So as we went to having a fully remote workforce and certainly identified that the opportunity to return to the office which initially we had a short timeline for. We started saying that it was going to be indefinite work from home. One of the things that we identified was an opportunity to support employees by allowing them to flexibly work from anywhere. So in some cases, what employees needed to be successful right now was to change location, potentially to change the space environment that they're in, or to be closer to somebody that was part of their support structure or their family. So that's really allowed us to lean into using technology for how people work together from anywhere, whether that's video technology for conversation, how we use internal collaboration tools to communicate asynchronously, or our weekly company all hands, which still happens in a virtual environment and is a space for employees to communicate and create community with themselves and with our leadership team.
I guess we'll take one last question from the audience. I would describe it as another one of those silver lining questions. If you could talk a little bit about the expanded geographic and cost of living options that have opened up, that have been opened up by a remote workforce. How does that play into your future diversity, equity, inclusion goals now that you have, presumably a much larger pool of candidates to look at?
Right. Well, and even our onboarding, remote onboarding starts with how we go through our recruiting process to get people aware and familiar with what Twitch is and what our workplace is like. So certainly having the opportunity to have people working in different locations versus specifically in our core offices has enabled us to find talent in new places and even to retain talent in the organization, again, as I mentioned, who had needed to move to other locations. So we continue to evolve how we're going to operate in an ongoing environment as people start to come out of COVID lockdowns and get out into the workplace and commuting and all of those things again. But I imagine a future where we will continue to have a great level of flexibility and in both in where people work and how often they come to the office. And without question, that creates new opportunities for us for finding talent and bringing talent successfully into the organization.
I think we learned a lot from you about Twitch and about the future of the workplace. And I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thanks for having me, Asia.
And thank you all for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. And thank you to our sponsor, Density, for making this event possible. And for more information or to sign up for Axios AM, visit axios.com/newsletters or visit us on the Axios app. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you on axios.com.